Well, the conference is about to start. And what do teachers usually do right before a conference starts? Well, usually we stand in front of the breakfast buffet wondering how much of the food was locally sourced, and then politely ask a hotel employee for a third key card because the first two didn't work. But now, from the comfort of your chosen space, you don't have to deal with any of that. So, you're welcome. Anyway, we are so glad you're here. And while the conference is free, we could not put on this kind of event without help from a lot of people. Leaders from Arizona, Maryland, Ohio, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, the World History Association, were all essential in making this event happen. So, if you enjoyed this conference as much as we think you will, do us a favor. Take a moment to join your local state council for the social studies. Join the WHA. It isn't much, but it makes a huge difference. Unlike the gym or that weekly box of vegetables, this is a membership you can actually use. So join up. Check out our contributors page for details.
Welcome back. All right. Now that our critical thinking muscles are fully warmed up after Jane's inspiring keynote, let's dive into the first of today's 3 live discussions, designing inquiry. As a topic in education, inquiry has understandably become a much higher priority in schools, districts, and states across the US for the last few years. I'm thrilled to introduce our live discussion participants who will be talking with us today about the importance and relevance of building inquiry skills in the socialist classroom. Our moderator is Tuyen Tran. Dr. Tran received her PhD in history from University of California, Berkeley in 2007. Dr. Tran's interests are 20th century United States history and Asian American history, particularly Southeast Asian American. She has taught at UC Berkeley, St. Mary's College, and Elleni College. As a graduate student researcher and teacher coach, Dr. Tran worked with the UC Berkeley, California History Social Science Project from 2002 to 2006, a lot of twos there. In addition, Dr. Tran authored The Newly Uprooted Southeast Asians in California, a 15-lesson history unit for Oakland Unified School District. Joining Dr. Tran is Elleni Abebe and Nick Dennis. Elleni has worked in education for 15 years and has taught 5th through 11th grade in public schools, charter schools, and schools abroad. Currently, she is an instructional coach at Roosevelt Senior High School here in Washington, D.C., and teaches 9th grade pre-AP World History and AP Seminar. Nick teaches history and politics in a school just outside of London, England. He is also a fellow of the School's History Project, England's premier think tank on historical education, and is a co-presenter for a collection of World History Project videos. He has also published a number of resources and articles on diversity in schools, pedagogy, leadership, and historical education. Tuyen, Elleni, Nick, take it away.
All righty, welcome. Thank you so much, Jason, and to the organizers of this conference for social studies, and especially to Nick and Elleni who are joining me today, and also for the Track Talk creators, Vicky, Derek, Nancy, Kate, Ryan, and Hardra. I hope I got your name right, and I apologize if I did not. And thank you for priming us with your Track Talks for discussion today. Welcome everyone who's online with us and meeting here to discuss how we as social studies educators can meet this moment. So much has shifted and the world seems almost upside down. And in this particular space, for this particular hour, let us invite inquiry in as a means to support student learning. Before we begin telling stories and sharing narratives, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous communities of where I work, which is Patwin, the Patwin people here in Davis, and then the Miwok from where I live in Elk Grove, California. They are the original inhabitants and stewards of the land that I occupy. They did not vanish and still survive to this day. I have learned of their displacement and genocide as a result of disease, the rush for gold, forced labor, and baptisms. I provide this land acknowledgement as someone who is also displaced from her own homeland as a result of war. And I also want, a recent practice I've done is that I incorporate also an acknowledgement of an ancestor for guiding me to this place here with you. This particular acknowledgement has become abundantly clear to me in more recent months. I worked on an entire unit to talk about the contributions of Filipino farm workers in the farm labor movement in California that brought about all these wonderful and world-changing sort of practices in migrant labor and in farm labor, particularly in California. And I completely did this lesson, multiple lessons, 25 lessons and a whole entire video. And not once did I think about my own parents who are bok choy farmers. There's a way in which we enter history and we divorce ourselves from it. You know, as a trained historian, I was told that like what I think and what I feel does not matter. It's all about the evidence. But that's a terrible, terrible lie. We want to make things relevant. We want to make our life histories relevant and be seen in what we study. And so I acknowledge my dad, who was a bok choy farmer and probably benefited, most likely, absolutely benefited from the migrant and from the farm worker movement of the 60s and 70s. So, and it is his story that makes my own storytelling possible. So on that note about storytelling and inquiry to support storytelling, Nick, you mentioned Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star as a reference point for good storytelling and inquiry. So maybe we can start with you about the importance of inquiry in your own instruction and in good storytelling.
Thank you, Tuyen. I will have to say that's not my original idea. It's from Martha Nussbaum, so I recognize that work there. But I think when I read her book, Cultivating Humanity, a few years ago, that notion stuck with me, that it is something which we get students to, or young people to think about very early, this sense of wonder. And it kind of goes with them. And one of the things that I think really drives my work in history classrooms, but also in politics classrooms is, how can we recreate this wonder, but also have this propelling question that creates this desire to know things for their own sake. So I think inquiry is really important in history. I'm not the first person to say it. It is an essential part of what makes history great or politics great. It is about dissent, debates, discussion, and it's trying to make sure you can bring that to life with the students, whatever topic that you're looking at. So inquiry questions for me are the kind of bread and butter of history teaching, and it's our job as stewards, as storytellers, as curriculum designers, to really kind of hold that in our minds when we're thinking about how can we create that kind of sense of awe and wonder and fascination with those topics.
And Elleni, the importance of inquiry in your classroom to inspire awe and wonder as well?
I think of it through a student's lens. Do you guys remember being students in K through 12 learning, and you just have back-to-back classes? Sometimes they're super long or boring, and you're being spoken to, like lectures. It's exhausting. It's exhausting for students, and unfortunately very difficult to keep them engaged. So why I love inquiry is it keeps students on their toes, and the strong questioning focuses students to really think deeply about the topics, and you're making them do the heavy lifting. So you as a teacher become a facilitator, so it strengthens you as a teacher as well. And you're creating this engaging classroom that truly fosters curiosity, like Nick said, and fosters students to think deeper and wider about the topics you're teaching. I think it transforms your classroom.
Yes, and I'm sure all of us, if we were to go back to how we were instructed in history, we all have a nightmare story, right? We all do. And how different I would have been. I'm already powerful. I think there's an activist streak in me, a social justice streak in me. but how much more powerful I would have been if someone like inspired inquiry me earlier on. Like for example, when I've learned about the Vietnam War, which my family never once talked about and I'm from Vietnam. When I learned about the Vietnam War in junior year in high school, the teacher, kid you not, did documentaries for 5 straight days. There was no lesson planning. It was just video for 5 straight days. So I watched napalm videos of Vietnamese people running around haggard, screaming for their lives, just like terrible, terrible instances of violence and just like no context whatsoever. And I just saw myself and my people as victims, right? And not as active agents and that had any perspective. And so I think like part of my life mission is to bring inquiry in to help to resolve that poor 16-year-old who was stuck in a classroom with a teacher who just wanted to just set it and forget it. So when I think about that classroom, I think about the ways in which inquiry would have really supported that lesson. For example, even in the recent chat box that we had here on our platform about everyone's sharing resources, and someone was asking about the Vietnam War and like what are good inquiry questions. I responded there. But that's just like an example of like really poor history instruction that could totally be revamped. Maybe Elleni and Nick, I know Elleni, you talked about World War I as a way for you to revamp a lesson to bring back the world. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, or another example of how you've revamped something as a result of inquiry.
Definitely. I think the thing about inquiry that's interesting while planning is that instead of thinking of the list of facts and names or a video to show students, you're thinking about huge issues, problems, events that happen, and framing it in a question to allow students to then explore and for students to find evidence. It's really based on having the strongest sources, a variety of multiple perspectives, so students can then weave their learning into what they're interested in. I've had students when learning about Vietnam War who are so interested in Agent Orange. They just want to learn more about the environmental impacts. They want to learn more about the government's role in science, and it just expands. And so by creating these questions, inquiry can promote the diversity of content as well and push students to be able to tie in interdisciplinary thoughts, whether it's science or math, economics, tying that into either war, whatever topic you're learning about. So in the planning process, I would say the context that you spoke of is really important, starting off with that historical thinking skill of understanding contextualization, but then pushing compelling questions daily, every couple of days. You might have 4, 5 in a unit that you're, depending on how your units are framed, that you're pushing students to elaborate on and engage with through primary sources. And so I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it absolutely did. A good inquiry question helps to like keep things moving. And helps to give purpose to like the instruction and why students are learning. There's nothing worse than us as adults when we enter into a meeting not knowing why we're there, and then maybe halfway or 3/4 of the way we figure out like why we were there. Well, our students are just like us. They want to know why is it that they're sitting in their seat, what is it they're supposed to be doing, and so it gives us a great purpose for learning. Now, Nick, when it comes to inquiry and we want to expand students' mind, we want them to ask deep questions, but what about the teachers who are worried about letting go of that textbook? Like how, lots of folks are like, how, if you do all inquiry, where does the background knowledge come from? Like how does the context get built in that case?
Okay, so I'll come to that question again if you remind me. I just wanted to touch on the early issue, and I was thinking when I taught the Vietnam War before, and it was in the larger kind of question about why the US got involved in the war, and I wanted the students, a big part of that inquiry was to get them to understand the difference between communism and nationalism, and the justifications that came out from the country and what was reported. And so I use that as a way to get them to think about what the resistance was like, what justifications people had. And then I gave them a kind of a potted history of the last 20 or 30 years in Vietnam and the surrounding areas. So they understood that. So that provided that context. So inquiry, I think, asked really well, allows you to do that, not necessarily taking the whole lesson, but it allows you to push the boundaries from that point of view. And that's what I think Elleni was saying in her video. It's that world part and pushing that, but it does, it seems to me, it compels you to look wider. And I think about inquiry questions in two senses here, and very much in the Western tradition. So Herodotus, the kind of father of history, in his book Historia, the Histories, he talks about historical inquiry being two parts. One, narrative, it's the story, but also asking questions about why are we here, what's happened. And what was really interesting in the histories is that he's not just interested in the Greeks, he's interested in the Persians and their customs and various other things. So there is this immediate idea in the kind of Western tradition to look wider rather than just focusing on a small aspect there. So I think, inquiry, I think, is really important. And now I've lost my train of thought because I was too busy focusing on that point. So what was the question again, Diane?
Well, I mean, thank you for bringing up Herodotus. I think you got trapped into the Herodotus trap, which is like telling a really great story that you get lost in the story.
Yes,
lost in the story. But like just going back, like the inquiry question, going back to the question is, for someone who doesn't have the deep background, and for the students who don't have the deep background, how do you teach, how do you contextualize stuff when it's not readily available in the historical evidence that you've compiled or you constructed? So what do you do? What is the main, is it secondary sources that you're reading? Is it the textbook? Is the textbook a deterrent? How do you feel about building that context?
I think it's really important that we understand the split in history teaching generally, that the textbook is not the curriculum. It is there to support what's being done rather than telling you exactly what's available, and different textbooks have different things. If I was starting an inquiry question from scratch, there would be a number of places that I would go, and especially if it was on world history or big history, I would of course go to the OER project resources and have a look at the materials and the resources that people have shared there in terms of thinking about particular questions. But I think for me, what makes inquiry questions incredibly powerful in history classrooms is how they are framed within historical concepts. So Peter Seixas talks about the big six concepts. So, historical significance, evidence, change, continuity, whatever one you're using, and using that to frame what you want to plan. So even if you're not sure about the actual content, you're thinking, well, am I asking a question about, well, how did things change? Am I asking a question about what causes, what caused this event? Am I talking about, what kind of evidence that we're looking at? And there are particular question stems. And just to point everyone to that, I put in one of the track discussion around my video, a couple of the examples. Now, they're not correct by any means, and the whole point about inquiry questions, as I was suggesting in my video, is that they're meant for discussion. But there are some examples of some stems that you can use. So if you're not really sure about what to do and you don't have people that you can bounce ideas off, go to the World History Project site, have a look at the resources there, but then also have a look at Seixas's work, but use those question stems to help you. So you're thinking, well, actually, I want to, we're interested in causes. So why did this happen? Or what was the main factor in this? So then you can say, okay, so I need to start thinking about causes. What do I need to do? I can go and have a look at some textbooks. I can get some, basic research together, and then think about what, I want the students to do. But I think even more important than that, and this is something Elleni and some of the other videos have mentioned, is working backwards. And I think about it as adults, or especially as teaching staff, when we're being sold a vision about something, we need to know if we're at A, we need to know what B looks like. We need to have a pretty good idea and say, this is where we want to get to. And that's essentially what we're doing for the students. We need to know what the outcome's going to look like so we can sell it to them, but we also need to understand what that's going to look like as well. And one of the things that I always try and do whenever I think about designing an inquiry is having a go at the end product myself, not even if I don't spend the whole time doing it. And this is an idea from project-based learning, which is do the project yourself. So if you're setting an essay or trying to get them to make a timeline or a video, have a go at doing it yourself. And you're thinking, actually, this may not work as an outcome activity, so I might need to tweak that.
I think what Nick is leading us to, I think what Nick is leading us to is this question that we actually, when we had a pre-talk just to get to know one another. The question I like to ask is, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Where do you start with the inquiry process? And Nick is talking about backwards planning, thinking about where you want to end up. And then I think I saw earlier someone asked what the big six concepts are. Is Peter Seixas's the big six? Is it the big six? I look back here like I can look at my book, but Peter Seixas is the name, out of Canada. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful human being and scholar. Okay, so thinking about which comes first, the chicken or the egg. So does your inquiry come first, or are you thinking about your historical concepts that you're trying to, or historical thinking concepts that you're trying to support your students' proficiency in? And when we're thinking about historical thinking concepts, we're thinking of continuity and change, causality, context. I like contingency as well, complexity, thinking about historical perspectives, historical empathy. Those are sort of some of the skills. So Elleni, where do you start in terms of like inquiry?
I think a lot of us, we have our curriculum, we have to follow either standards or units. So you have this unit on imperialism or on the industrialization, industrial revolution. And so I start with the standards because we usually have to. And then I start to think, okay, what's my compelling question? That's when I start to draft my inquiry arc. And so I love that it's an arc because it continues throughout your entire unit. So you have this one big question, and then your supporting questions are just as important. I think that gets lost sometimes in inquiry, reminding yourself that you have these building questions daily that lead students to their big question at the end. And they're practicing those historical thinking skills around argumentation at the end of the day daily, so that when they get to their summative performance task, their argument is so strong and you've worked on the skills throughout. And so while I start with that compelling question, as you're planning your unit, or even as you're teaching your unit, quite frankly, you might change your question. And I would be transparent with students about that. Maybe put a new question right next to, I picture, like you said about wanting to go into a meeting and know what that agenda looks like. I picture my classroom and I'll always have the unit title and then the compelling question right up there. Students know what it is from day one. And sometimes throughout we'll add more questions or student created questions, which are the best. Like they ask something, I'm like, I should have thought of that. That's great. And then I use it the next year and even in that unit. And so I would tell new teachers or teachers new to inquiry to be willing to take chances, to be transparent with students about your thought process and ask them for their thoughts or their interests, and be okay with revamping it as you go along, especially if you're truly responding to students and creating a culturally relevant classroom that's really grounded in your community. You will see those changes happen during an inquiry arc and be okay with it. And you get more comfortable with that the more you do it and the more you know your community and your students.
And Nick, I know you spend an inordinate amount of time, because you write curriculum, thinking about inquiry questions. What makes a good inquiry question?
Oh, good grief. I wish, you know,
Feel free
if
to
I
jump
give
in
you
the
an
lane
answer,
at any
yeah,
point.
yeah, everyone can
Okay.
go on. I think, and I think going back to your original question about the chicken and egg, I think I can give two answers. As a new teacher, a very long time ago, I started with the question first and then tried to build lessons around it. So this is, you know, what I saw from my peers, other history teachers that I encountered, and used that to build the capacity within myself to do so. Now, because I have that experience and because I'm you know, always reading kind of historical literature as well, and as you mentioned about curriculum design, I start at the end and then work backwards. But it's a journey to get to that point, and it's not necessarily easy. But I think of it almost, you know, like the kind of separation of powers in the US from that point of view, that you kind of know things are separate, but it's very murky. But because designing an inquiry is a curriculum plan, so as in what topics we're going to look at, what skills, what historical concepts we're going to look at, then there's the pedagogical choice about the teaching methods that help you do that. So, for example, the example that I mentioned in the video around, you know, did towns make people free? That's a really good inquiry question. I never would have come up with that. So I'm like, okay, this is a good inquiry question. What can I do? So I'm now thinking, what is my outcome here? So that I'm now thinking at the endpoints and then working backwards. So, you know, that's a really interesting question. What am I going to get the students to produce? But between, you know, once I've decided that, I can pick a whole range of pedagogical outcomes. So I might do a role play, for example, as students, as living in the villages, you know, going around, talking to other people, experiencing, you know, the kind of discussions and ideas, so then they can build that knowledge as well. So it's a mixture of all those things, and that's what I'm trying to say about the separation of powers. It's, in one sense, it's fused, as is the case in the US, but I think it's really important to separate that out. So as a beginning teacher, I would start with the question first, because that builds my confidence and looking at what other people have done. Now I work completely the other way. And I think it's also important in inquiry that the inquiry that you're designing at the time shouldn't be seen in isolation from what else you're planning over the year, or even over 2, 3, or 4 years. Because then once you map that, and that's something else that one of the other videos mentioned, you know, you can really see, am I focusing on changing continuity? Am I focusing on historical evidence? And that may not be the central question that you're looking at every single inquiry, but you can map over a year. Well, they look at this in a number of ways, and we're building their capacity from, you know, grades 7 in my country, up until they start doing examinations, external examinations like the AP. So then how do you build that capacity? And I think that's something that I think is really important when designing inquiry.
What I'm hearing from both of you is that there's a lot of front loading to getting inquiry, to be able to teach with an inquiry-based model. So for the new teacher who might be among us, who has not done that, who has not done inquiry and is intimidated by it, what advice would you give in terms of how much work it is and how one streamlines a process for inquiry, and is it even possible? Elleni?
Yeah, can I also start with answering the question about what makes a good inquiry question?
Yes, please.
And this ties to, for new teachers, the advice. I just think it's really important to remember that your question cannot be Google. It's not a straight yes or no, right or wrong answer. And that means it shouldn't be surface level. It should be concise, definitely student friendly, whatever grade level you're teaching, and promote digging deeper, sorry. So when you have a compelling question and it's debatable in an authentic way, that's a strong inquiry question. Something that you continue to go back to throughout your entire unit. And like Nick said, even throughout your year, it keeps coming back up. And so that's my advice, to make sure that you are truly giving students the variety of perspectives needed to make it debatable and to make it interesting. Push yourself to think about your own implicit bias or where you always go to for sources, and push yourself to try to think of different lenses, like how an environmentalist might feel about this topic, or how a local might feel about this topic. It kills me how many times we're learning about decolonization and then the sources are from like British people. And so, and so it's just like, think about where your sources are coming from. I like sticking with primary sources. I think it helps students do the thinking and pushes historical thinking skills. And for new teachers, this might seem daunting, but truly, truly it transforms your classroom and makes it so much more fun. It is. And I think students will really treasure and appreciate what you're doing in your classroom when they see you're trying something new, if it is new in your district, or at least that you trust them to guide their learning. It creates a classroom built around openness because there's discourse and debate, and students, I think, really appreciate it. So I would say just try to be authentic and open-minded.
Okay, this is going to be a slight detour, but I think it will get us back here. Okay. Hopefully it won't be that big, but Nick mentioned historical, not reenactments, but like simulations. And I know, Elleni, your track talk also talked about the Versailles, sort of the conferencing and the different countries that are vying for an outcome that is beneficial to them. I wonder, how does inquiry support these possible sort of like non-traditional practices that you can incorporate as part of your instruction?
If I go first, I mean, I think, absolutely, because, doing a reenactment on medieval village life, and there's an example I'll quickly tell you about, where I pretend I'm William the Conqueror in 1066 in England, who basically takes control of the country. And one of the activities is I get the students to bring their teddy bears in at the end, and I go around pretending I'm the Conqueror, moving all the castles, they're moving around, and I'm speaking in French, which they may not have a very good understanding. I get another student to act as a kind of translator and read out what I'm saying. And the culmination of the activity is I pick up a teddy bear and I cut its head off or ear off. When students are 11, they're like, what is going on? First of all, whose is it? Now, it sounds ridiculous in one sense. And of course, it's normally something that I've got from the charity shop, so it's no one else's. But they remember that because they think, oh my word, I've got this emotional connection. But the reason why I'm doing it's not just a fun activity. It's I'm really trying to get them to understand what was Norman rule like in England after 1066. And so once they get that, they're thinking, well, actually, it was quite brutal. The teddy bear's head got cut off. And I can understand why people were really worried and concerned about it. So it's the activity is fun in itself, but that's not the point. The point is that it's within an inquiry. So the inquiry is driving that particular activity. Now, I will say that's not something I do all the time, because I would be tired if I did that all the time as well. But that's what I meant by working backwards. If the inquiry and the skills, the kind of historical concepts are driving that, then you can choose your pedagogical tool to get that point across. And that would be one lesson. And then we would, have a debrief and talk about what did it mean and how, and then talk about the historical events so they now can see it as, being really important for them and how we're going to answer the particular question at the end and create the product that we're going to look at.
And Elleni, do your students come out being aspiring diplomats?
Something like that. Sometimes they truly do enjoy the argumentation part. I think it's interesting because in the blueprint itself, because you're asking like, where does this even fall in planning and how do you do it? It's seen as an extension activity around the summative performance task. And a lot of us focus on the performance task as your assessment. And I see these activities not as extensions, even though formally the C3 framework calls it an extension. I see it as just a very imperative part of my classroom and the learning experience. Usually the way I plan it is that, like the Treaty of Versailles example, you'll have this simulation maybe a day before your assessment, before you do a DBQ essay, or you have some sort of multiple choice assessment, whatever the assessment is. And students at so much practice at BATS, at the curriculum, at the facts, at their argumentation, and that discourse and experience helps them do so much better on their assessment the next day. And then I reveal what really happens, maybe like the next day after.
Revealing what really happened, I find it incredulous that your students did not Google what happened.
Google it. I know. I'm pretty lucky.
They don't. They really do not Google what happens. They really get into the role play.
So it hasn't happened yet. I've had students go home and Google it. So then when because if they don't know it's coming, I do it all usually in one class, especially when we have longer block schedules. Right. So then they go home, or they might have like Googled it or talked to someone, and then they'll come in the next day like, oh my gosh, that really happened. Or did you know that, like, you know, China didn't get their territories they were promised. So it is interesting. And I do love when they do that, because it shows that curiosity is truly like, it's real. Like, I didn't say go Google it, get extra credit. They did it on their own. But that's why I try also not to tell them it's happening, so that they don't Google it on their own. But I will say these projects, they don't always have to be simulations. They can be presentations, multimedia, and it provides us a chance to give students the real skills they'll need. I mean, you're a professor, right? The real skills they'll need when they get to college, when they get to the real world jobs, the presentation skills, the teamwork skills. And so I think it pushes us to think of the holistic child, and not just our content, but also how are we making sure they're ready when they leave our schools and they join the world in any other role, not just as a K through 12 student. And so I think it's important, and it makes it more fun. Like, they have something to look forward to. My students always like, what are we doing at the end of this unit? Because I change it up. Maybe it's a simulation one time, maybe a huge debate they're doing, or a mock trial. They love the mock trials. Those take longer to plan. So if you keep them on your toes, they're actually thinking like, wow, this is fun.
Thank you. And so I think you bring up a really good point about that these are life skills, right? Like this inquiry, sparking awe and wonder, as in Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, how I wonder what you are, that they become lifelong skills. Specific to the discipline of history, what are some lifelong skills that you find yourself that comes out of, you know, inquiry learning, aside from the curiosity and the wonder, of course?
I think, if I go first, if that's okay, I think it's evidence for me, or using sources, which I think is a lifelong skill, as we've seen in the last few years, where people, and you know, some of the track talk videos mentioned where people are just sending stuff. And there is an additional pressure in England, where history is only compulsory from the ages from 11 to 14. And then you cannot do history anymore. So one of the things that drives us and thinking about inquiry questions is, you know, students aren't taking the subject after they're 14. We need to make sure they understand this range of skills before they never have another history lesson ever again, possibly for the rest of their lives. So the use of evidence and testing the evidence and corroborating and comparing and contrasting. And once you get students into that kind of framework in terms of using it, especially with inquiries and using, you know, different questions, you know, looking at different historical skills, but you're bringing evidence in where you're saying, well, it ain't necessarily so from this particular source. You know, Elleni mentioned about empire and having just, you know, British sources. You know, I find that incredulous if I was teaching that as well for, you know, for my students. And it would be looking at different views and saying, actually, you know, that's what a narrative is. It's a story. It's not a complete story. And so, you know, we need to try and get as much of the kind of complete story, if we can have one, as possible. And that means that we need to look at different things. So that's one of the things that I think inquiry can give, which is this kind of skeptical view of evidence, not not rejecting it outright, but just saying, that's really interesting. Let me go and check. And I think that's a good thing for the students to take away with them.
Yeah,
I
I
think
agree. One of the most powerful things you can ask a student is, how do you know that? Right?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because evidence is something that a lot of courses work on, right? Science, there's evidence. Math, there's evidence. And I think thinking of historical thinking skills, while the evidence is so important and argumentation, Nick, I push them to also think about like the source analysis, the perspective taking, that leads to like what you were saying about the whole idea of maybe fake news, which kids get really excited about, or kind of determining reliability. And so that historical interpretation of source analysis and also looking at contextualization. And so when I coach teachers, I try to remind them as history teachers, we are pushed to help reading and writing skills. And that's always something all teachers should be pushing. But something that makes us different than, let's say, an English teacher is that we also really want to push contextualization and source analysis. And so those are some of the historical thinking skills that I think are extremely important during any history class, but also inquiry helps foster that type of learning and that curiosity around, well, why are we using this source? What other sources could strengthen my argument? How can I disprove my teammate over there when we're debating? Well, now I have to like really think critically about their sources they're using as well. And it pushes students to ask each other those difficult questions. Like, where did you get that source from? Why? How do you know?
And I think that's, yeah, and I think that point that you made about asking questions, and from a number of the history lessons that I know from that other history teachers have taught over the last year or so, it's been interesting where the students have asked other students who've got background knowledge which is not necessarily in the history syllabus, and they're able to bring that to bear on what is happening to give a real context. So having the ability to discuss and ask questions, saying, well, actually, I think I know this, but actually, what else do you know? What can you bring? Which is not in the actual textbook, or even what the teacher is saying, that can be brought into the conversation.
Which, I mean, thank you for bringing that, which leads to one of the sort of, I think, in terms of like why you do inquiries, like everything you mentioned, and also just being able to impart on students this independence with inquiry themselves, right? That they are curious about the world and they ask really great inquiry questions. And they don't take things as an assumed thing, like that's just the way it happened. It was in the past, and not thinking about like sort of contingencies and complexities and all that good stuff. So
can I add on there?
yes, please.
Okay. So I saw in the chat someone asked about like kids asking their inquiry questions as well. And our last unit is unit 10 about globalization and world history. And students actually create their own inquiry when they're working on their culminating portfolio project in my classroom, and they love it. And it's based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, where they get to tie in, when I heard you speaking about like, how do they not just see it as something that happened in the past, but tie it to what's going on now or what's real in their community and their lives. And through this culminating project where they create their own inquiry and and they share it in a multimedia presentation with their classmates, they have to tie in, I mean, there's a whole syllabus around it, but they have to tie in 3 examples from 3 units we've learned about and how it connects. And I think making connections is also a really important skill for them around their argument. And so using the UN Sustainable Development Goals as an example of these issues of clean water or land, it's nothing new. We started today with giving thanks to those who were here before us. Like it's been centuries of these issues. And so how do students then create an inquiry, see how the past connects to the current and might even impact their future as children, right? Like they still are working towards these solutions. And so that change and continuity over time is really interesting for students as well. I think my students get excited about that skill because they like to find the changes, what stayed the same. And sometimes they're shocked that there are issues that continue to happen like hundreds of years later, and push them to think of the solutions.
Nick, how are you?
Yeah.
How are you inspiring your own student inquiries?
Oh goodness.
Did you want to respond to Elleni's?
No, I was just going to add, but I'll try and think about that particular question as well. And I was thinking about getting the students to generate the inquiry questions so they understand, what you're doing as part of the kind of teaching and learning process. And so it's creating the stimulus for them to say, well, this seems crazy. So why, what kinds of questions can we ask? What evidence might we need to look at? And that can be built into the inquiry questions. And it made me think, and I think I spoke about this last year at the OC, because it had a huge effect on my teaching, was coming across a picture of someone called Hans J. Massacre, who lived in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. And there is a picture of Hans J. Massacre when he's around about 7 or 8 in school in Germany in the 1930s. He kind of looks like me, and he's standing there with a jumper on with a Nazi swastika sewn on it. Blows my mind every time I look at that picture, because I'm thinking, hang on, everything I know about Nazi Germany tells me that there's something not quite right here. And using that source as a piece of evidence for students, they're like, hang on a minute, this is what we kind of know. How did he get there? Why is he wearing this? What's he doing there? Why is he in school? Is he where is he? And that creates, really good inquiry questions that might fit the kind of wider inquiry question, which will, for me, might be, what was life like, what was social life like in Nazi Germany? I mean, his story is absolutely incredible, but that's a really good way of thinking about using the evidence there to get the students to generate the questions themselves. In terms of generating inquiry questions or using them, as I said, it's an essential part of my teaching. And when I go back in September, I also teach politics. And the first, and this is for 16 to 18 year olds, one of the first questions that I will ask is, how do we think about the world? That's the question that I ask them. And that's the big question. And then I break it down into the smaller component parts about, what do we think about what the state is? How do we think about globalization or territories? What kind of language do we use? Where do humans fit into that story as well? And so that is a really good way that I think, and the students seem to really enjoy it, as a way of getting them to think about, quite a serious question, especially on the topic that they've never really thought about before. To think, well, actually, yeah, we think about the world in very different ways, but it also means that they take a step back from what are the kind of common sense assumptions about the world and say, well, actually, this is something which is constructed. And so therefore we can change that if we want to. So I think that's another, that's why I think inquiry questions are important. As Simon Sharma, the historian, I think he's based at Columbia now, he talks about, it's dissent and debate. That's what makes it really interesting. If I can make the students dissenters in my lesson, not only just in case of what I'm teaching them, but as they go out, I think I would have done a pretty good job.
And Elleni, have you thought about what inquiry question that you're going to pose when you return to the classroom?
To start off with?
Yes.
I plan for 2 different courses. So for my AP seminar class, I will say we're working around liberty and security. And so talking this out loud for the first time, it's not completely draft, but interested in see what you guys think. Thinking about having students question what's more important to them, or why, or to society, liberty or security. And so I haven't framed it exactly how I'd like to, especially because I said it has to be concise and also student friendly. And so I'm still thinking that through, but something around what's more important for society or as an individual, and also trying to look at that, like, do we look at it from the individual lens or as a community, or let students choose which way they go? But that's our first theme, and it's exciting. I mean, we'll be looking at government assassinations, for example,
I mean, that's so, that, I feel like that would be a really great opening question as we enter in school where we don't know if someone is vaccinated or not vaccinated and what are the rules around asking
Masks.
someone is and what their rights are, the individual versus the group. Yeah. I
Yeah,
love
so
it.
I'm excited to see how it
Yes.
pairs with both their lives as students, with COVID and everything going on, and then also just politically as well, and even
Yes.
environmentally. And so looking at it through different lenses. I will say too, Nick, when you were speaking about questions, just for teachers new to this, thinking about, well, how do I even start with getting students ask questions? Another technique I love is the question formulation technique, and really pushing students to just brainstorm as many as they can with just no judgment. So if you're not familiar with it, you can Google it, or maybe we can drop the source in the chat for them. But the question formulation technique is great with images like Nick explained as your do now, and then you're building students' curiosity and ability throughout, because you don't just jump to my unit 10 project out of nowhere. You're practicing these skills throughout the entire year, and then students will feel confident doing it themselves.
And then they will
Absolutely.
learn how to curate the questions,
Exactly.
consolidate, categorize, and all that wonderful stuff when you're working
Yeah.
with questions. Okay, so I'm acknowledging that we have 9 minutes left,
Oh,
and I
wow.
think there might be some questions for you, our lovely discussants. Trevor or anyone else? I think I'm supposed to click on this question, Q&A. Okay, all right. Are you all seeing these as well? Okay, so here we go. What is the relationship between teaching inquiry as a method and teaching important content? Does one come before the other? Can both be done together? I think we talked about that a little bit, haven't we? Did you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I think they can be taught together, and I think it's necessary, because without good knowledge of a topic, you can't really answer the actual question. So yes, you can think about the inquiry question or the kind of process, but they actually need to have the stuff. And that's what I meant by starting at the end. If you know what you want to produce, then going through the process and making sure they have the content so they can actually answer the question is a good thing.
Okay, so there are 2 questions I definitely want to cover before our time is up. So we have 8 minutes. Be mindful of this, okay? One question is, how do you build inquiry for younger students? Love it. And then the second one is, how do you let students determine the inquiry problem or question, and to what degree can a teacher let them choose their own sources or evidence to answer the problem? So I feel like that second question is about scope and sequence, right? Like that these skills build upon one another. And so, thinking about scaffolding, eventually you move towards greater independence where the students will be able to do that. But I think Elleni mentioned early on that, exercises like formulating a ton of questions initially around one source builds their question making abilities, right?
Can I just say for younger students, because inquiry can be used at any grade level, and I really want to push that. For example, with first graders, I would just ask, do rules matter? You just break it down. You break government, you break all these ideas to like, you're standing in line for the water fountain. Like, why do rules matter? And they start thinking about the ideas without really putting all the technical words behind it. And at least you're having these philosophical debates or questions with students that really matter in their day-to-day life, and you're building the foundational skills for them to be strong historians when they get older.
Yeah, I agree. And meet them where they're at. Like, how do you know something is fair?
Yeah.
Because they love to tell you when something is not fair.
Yeah.
So they need to give you evidence of what is fair. Like, how do they determine what is fair? So yes, there are intrinsic things that young children are absolutely curious and passionate about. So meet them where they're at.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we actually have time for one more question. Let's see. Okay, there were some questions about resources, but we can put that in the after party. and resources. Okay, how do you gather resources? I have tons of places, and we can do that in the after party. Okay, here, this is one we didn't get to. I'm curious about how inquiry explorations can help challenge the dominant emphasis on political, economic, and military events rather than events related to arts, culture, religion, philosophy, science, etc. In your track talk, Nick, you presented questions that challenge the boundaries around periodization, which I really love too. Can we talk about how to formulate inquiry questions that help students challenge what we consider an important event or pivotal historical turning point?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question about historical significance. And one of the kinds of questions that I think I would ask is, why do we remember, this particular event? And I think this is where it leads into the discussion over the last year or 2 years, even 3 years, around statues and memorialization, and about why have these things been created and when they have been created, which is fascinating. There is last year the statue of Edward Colston, who was involved in the slave trade in Bristol, was taken down, and people were, felt quite aggrieved about it, because, they said it's a heritage piece of work. It wasn't made at the time, it came a long time afterwards. And the people of Bristol have been very aggrieved about the statue being there and have asked for it to be removed and put in a museum. So they weren't saying, let's throw it away. They just said that this needs greater context as well. So I think there are ways of using, different, or using inquiries to kind of challenge that. And so that question is, why is the kind of the statue of Edward Colston in this prominent place? Might be a really good local history inquiry question to ask. And then you can get into discussions around in local newspapers at the time and what people said, the kind of minutes about council meetings, which could sound very boring, but then the students are saying, well, no, we think it should go somewhere else. It brings it alive. So I think there's lots of ways.
I want to stop you right there. Elleni, I'm going to give you the last 30 seconds.
I'll just say, I don't know if we can drop it into the chat, but just Google AP seminar lenses. The lenses, if you're thinking about cultural, music, artistic, philosophical, it pushes students to think about difficult issues or topics through different lenses, whether it's AI and futuristic or political. And so using those lenses in your class, putting a poster up of different lenses and just making students take on different perspectives while debating or thinking of a topic or an issue in history will really push you to think outside of just wars or economy.
Back to you, Jason.
All right. Well, thank you very much for letting us be a part of that conversation. I love this topic. I teach an elementary social studies methods class for grad students, and my favorite lesson is when we get into inquiry, specifically compelling and supporting questions. You can tinker with one for like hours, for days. It'll never really feel like it's there, but it's always great to kind of roll those out. My favorite tester is, and this is a little dated, so bear with me, is would the Miami Heat have been successful without LeBron James? And like thinking about that in that context and breaking it down, seeing the supporting questions that are kind of buried in there, it's always kind of fun to grapple with that. So yeah, you took me right back to those moments. I started scribbling down notes so I can make this this semester a little bit stronger than the last ones, but I love it. Thank you, honestly, for letting us be a part of all that fun.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
All right. As always, there's an after party discussion thread being posted into the chat right now. Feel free to jump in if you have comments or questions for peers about this great session that we were able to watch. At 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, we look forward to seeing you at our next live discussion, Assessing Historical Thinking. Assessment is always a hot topic for social studies teachers, and I don't want to question your commitment to this conference. So if you pass on the next engaging live discussion, it'll be a huge fail on your part. Yep, I did it. See you in about 30 minutes. And don't forget the 2-question Zoom poll. There we go. We would love your feedback, so please fill it out. See you in a bit.